As the conflict in Iran begins to die down, I want to talk about the history of Iran. How did we get here? And to do that, we need to cover a little bit of history. Iran during the 1940s, during the Second World War, was under the rulership of Reza Shah, born Reza Khan, who essentially was in charge of a quasi-parliamentary rural dictatorship in Iran, where there was a parliamentary system, but the king had essentially had all the executive power and a lot of power centralized on him. He gets ousted in 1941 when both the Soviet Union and the British invade Iran in what's called the Anglo-Soviet intervention in Iran. The reason for this is because the British and Soviets are worried that Reza Shah will block sources in terms of Lend-Lease going into the Soviet Union through the Persian Gulf, because Reza Khan is very sympathetic or empathetic to the Nazis and Adolf Hitler. He is replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was born and raised and educated in the West, and they see him as more amenable to American and British influence than his father was, who was very anti-British, and the British and the Americans and the Soviets all knew this. What happens is that when Mohammad Reza Pahlavi is the Shah, the second Shah, the Pahlavi dynasty, Iran becomes a more parliamentary democracy, and he becomes more of a constitutional monarch. And so what happens is that after the end of the Second World War, the biggest issue in Iran is over the Iran Anglo Oil Company, founded as the Persian Anglo Oil Company or the Persian English Oil Company. It's essentially BP, because they have exclusive rights to the mining and refining and selling of Iranian oil. They only paid £1 for the lease, which lasts all the way up into the 1990s, and Iran is not getting the benefit of this agreement that they should have. In 1951, we get a new character, and by that, it's a return of someone who was involved in politics in Iran during the 20s, but left politics, but then he comes back in 51, Mohammad Mossadegh. So Mossadegh is elected prime minister ahead of a left-wing coalition with a right wing of clerics supporting him, and he is going to vote to nationalize the oil, the Iranian Anglo Oil Company, and put it under a new state-owned company. Now, before he does this, he sends a ultimatum to BP, to the Persian Anglo Oil Company, the Iranian Anglo Oil Company, asking them to fulfill an audit. They don't fulfill the audit. Mossadegh puts in the motion to nationalize the Iranian Anglo Oil Company, and it passes unanimously. This is a very popular feeling among Iranians, both in the parliament and in the voting body itself, of anti-Britishness, of that we are getting screwed by the British, and they really were. When this happens, the Prime Minister of England at the time, Clement Attlee, puts Iran under an oil embargo. So they are not benefiting from the new nationalized oil. They cannot sell it. So it's essentially causing the economy to collapse, making Mossadegh's decision unpopular, or beginning to become unpopular because of this oil embargo. Clement Attlee, who's the head of Labour and the Labour government that succeeds the Second World War government of Winston Churchill, is voted out of office, and Churchill comes back. Churchill is a staunch defender of British imperialism, and he draws up a plan called Operation Boot with MI6, and he reaches out to the Americans in order to get involved in this. The Americans' new Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, and Eisenhower is going to approve this in 1953. Now, I want to rewind a little bit to the creation of the CIA. The CIA gets created in 1947 with the National Security Act under the presidency of Harry Truman, which creates the office, what its jurisdiction is, and it gives it a director of the CIA. Its powers are then expanded in the Central Intelligence Agency Act of 1949, which essentially exempts the CIA from budgetary restrictions of Congress, which essentially removes it from checks and balances. Its budget does not have to be approved by Congress. Therefore, it does not have congressional oversight because Congress controls the purse strings. Truman never used the CIA. He is the president that uses the nukes in Japan, but Truman understands, I think very early on, that the CIA as a weapon of clandestine operations may set a dangerous precedent during the now growing Cold War that is going on during the late 40s and 50s. This is when the Soviets get their own nuclear weapon, and this is when the Korean War is going to go off. Truman is then replaced by Eisenhower, who's voted in 1952, takes office in 1953. Eisenhower has a different approach. Eisenhower wants to actually limit military spending. Eisenhower is very much trying to pull America back in terms of its military usage after the Korean War. And obviously, one of the things was Douglas MacArthur asking to nuke China, which was a very contentious thing with the Truman administration. And Eisenhower is very worried about the growth of a military budget and of nuclear weapons themselves, because he sees nukes as an alternative to the military. And that's why nuclear weapons were developed, is that they were developed as alternates to the military budget, essentially to limit it. And so Eisenhower is much more amenable to using alternative strategies to complete strategic objectives. In this case, the changing of a government in Iran that is more amenable to American foreign policy. And so in 1953, Eisenhower will approve what we now know as Operation Ajax. The CIA drew up in 51. Truman doesn't give the go-ahead, but Eisenhower will. And essentially what happens is the CIA takes money and they start bribing clerics in Iran, essentially the people that were part of Mossadegh's voting bloc, and they start also paying for demonstrators and gangs in the streets of Tehran in order to show popular dissent with Mossadegh as a preempt movement to get the Shah to come to Iran and remove Mossadegh from power, which he could do. He did have that constitutional right, but all he wanted was a reason to do it. And the CIA engineers that reason with MI6 and the British in Operation Boot/Operation Ajax. And so Mossadegh is removed from power in 1953, and he is placed under house arrest by Mohammad Reza Shah. And what happens afterwards is very important, because this is where it gets the most important for today. This essentially ruins American relations with Iran at this time, because before, relations between the Iranian people and the British were the ones that were the most, how would you say, contentious. But America was seen as a liberating force. But when they back Mossadegh to get overthrown, who was still popular in 53 and was the elected minister, and he's replaced with Mohammad Reza Shah, the Americans are seen as just as bad as the British, which they did not have the reputation before 1953. And what happens also is that Mohammad Reza Shah is going to create essentially a rural dictatorship where more power is stripped away from the parliament and engineered around the king, even more so than when he had his father in charge. And he also is going to create SAVAK, S-A-V-A-K, which is going to be the secret police, which is now changed into the religious police under the current Islamic Republic. And Mohammad Reza Shah is going to get rid of the Iranian Anglo Oil Company, which is now BP, and replace it with a conglomerate of different American and British companies. And this is the thing we have to learn from this. The CIA does its first successful coup, and this is what the historians within the CIA are talking about. That is the most successful coup where they took a parliamentary democracy with a constitutional monarch and changed it into a rural dictatorship that is amenable to U.S. foreign policy. And with this, they have done this without any American lives being lost, very minimal funding, and it changes the strategic outlook where Mossadegh is a socialist. He is very amenable to the Tudeh party, the Communist Party of Iran, but also has appealed to the clerics and to the right, and replaced him with an absolute rural dictator who is very vehemently anti-communist. And so because of this, it sets a precedent for what the CIA is going to do through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, even really up to today, though a lot of things are going to change in the 70s, and that can be a video that I cover in the future as I work on my other videos on Iran, Contra, and everything else. But what Operation Ajax shows us is that it shows us that America has changed how it does regime change. Before, it used to use the Navy and the Marines to do regime change. The Banana Wars are a good example. But now it's going to use clandestine operations for this, and this is going to set a pattern of American interference in the democratic processes of many other countries after Iran. And Iran is going to serve as the blueprint and template of how you do that. Oust a popular leader, put in a more conservative amenable leader, bribe local officials to support that, to show popular unrest, etc., etc. We'll see this pattern repeat throughout that. Ironically, Mohammad Reza Shah is going to try and renationalize some of the oil during the 70s and help create OPEC, but by this time he is becoming vastly unpopular in Iran through his secret police and his cracking down opposition, and America also starts to pull back from supporting Iran, which is eventually going to lead to the collapse of the Shah's government in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution.